Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DeT Podcast S.1 Episode 3. I'm your host and autism specialist for our school district, Dana Johnson. Today's podcast focuses on an essential topic of how autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, affects communication, specifically receptive and expressive language. Understanding how students with ASD process and use language helps us better support them in classrooms, hallways, cafeterias, and beyond that. Communication does challenge, but it's just not simply an academic issue. It affects their peer relationships, their behavior, emotional regulation, and independence. But my goal today is to help you recognize common communication patterns in students with autism and understand how we can support them effectively. So the first thing we can talk about is defining receptive and expressive language. Let's start with the definitions. Receptive language refers to a student's ability to understand language, including spoken words, gestures, facial expressions, written text, all the things, right? So, for example, when a teacher says, "Put your math book away and line up quietly," receptive language is required to understand both steps of that direction, so multi-step directives. While expressive language, on the other hand, is the ability to communicate your thoughts, your needs, and ideas using speech, gestures, writing, or any kind of alternative communication systems such as PICs, right? So an example of expressive language is a student saying, "I need help," raising their hand, or using a communication device to request a break. Students with autism may experience challenges in one or both areas, and those challenges can look very different from student to student. But how does that language manifest in autism? So autism in students, a lot of times it shows up as difficulty understanding. So when we talk about receptive language deficits, sometimes they have a difficulty understanding multi-step directions, figurative language such as idioms, or if you use sarcasm, they can be very literal, right? Abstract concepts like time, emotions, or social expectations. For instance, a scholar may appear non-compliant when asked to finish your work and then clean up, but the student may have processed that only the first part of the direction. But expressive language deficits could include limited vocabulary, difficulty forming complete sentences, trouble explaining thoughts, emotions, or experiences. So in the classroom, this might look like a student who knows an answer, but can't quite convey the message in a clear and concise manner. In the non-academic setting, such as receptive and expressive, such as recess, expressive language challenges can make it difficult for them to want to join games, resolve conflicts, or ask for help, because sometimes that can lead to frustration or withdrawal. And how does that affect communication? How do those speech patterns affect communication? In addition to language deficits, many students with autism display atypical speech patterns that affect how their communication is perceived and understood. So these speech patterns are not intentional and should not be mistaken for rudeness or a lack of effort, but instead they reflect differences in how language develops and is used by individuals with autism. Understanding those patterns allows us as educators and staff to respond with patience and appropriate support rather than misinterpretation. And there's 5 common speech patterns in students with autism spectrum disorder. And the 5 common speech patterns often observed in students with autism, along with real-world examples such as echolalia. I'm sorry, that's a difficult word for me at times. Echolalia, which is them repeating words or phrases spoken by others. So if you ask them, "Do you want a snack?" and they'll respond, "Want a snack?" Or scripted speech, such as something that you memorize a phrase from movies, shows, or books. That can show, for instance, as a student says a cartoon catchphrase, and instead of answering the question, they just pretty much say what was said. So the third one would be your monotone or your unusual prosody, where speech may sound flat, robotic, or unusually like singing a song. The fourth one is literal interpretation of language, which is difficulty understanding figurative language. So if I were to say, hold your horses, the student would look confused. That's a figure of speech, but in that student's mind it's very literal. So they really think you're supposed to hold your actual horses, right? And the fifth one is pragmatic. So these are challenges with students that have conversational rules but can't seem to abide by them. So a student may interpret frequently, talk about one interest, or struggle with turn taking. And then there's 3 common difficulties resulting from that. The first one is social interactions. The second one is behavioral frustration. And the third is academic participation barriers. And recognizing the communication root of those challenges helps prevent mislabeling behaviors as defiance, noncompliance, or disengagement. So speech language pathologists, or what we call SLPs, they play a critical role in supporting students with autism, and they assess communication strengths and needs and design the individualized interventions. So in schools, the school language pathologists may teach expressive and receptive language. They may support social communication and conversational skills. They may introduce augmentative and alternative communication systems, which we refer to as AAC. They may collaborate with the teacher and the case manager to adapt classroom language. They may coach staff with visual support, simplify language and modeling strategies. So other related service providers such as occupational therapists and school psychologists, they often collaborate with the SLPs to address sensory, behavior, and social emotional factors that impact communication. So in closing, understanding expressive and receptive language in students with autism spectrum disorder, it allows us to create more inclusive, supportive learning environments. When we recognize communication challenges early and collaborate with our SLPs and families, we empower students to connect, learn, and thrive. Again, this is your autism specialist and your host, Dana Johnson. Thank you for tuning in to the DeT Podcast Season 1, Episode 3, and I will see you soon. Peace.